In 1967, in a wooden dacha at Petrovo Dalneye, about an hour's drive west of Moscow, an old man who had once ruled the Soviet Union was beginning what the state around him would come to consider a crime. He was 73 years old. He had been deposed from power 2.5 years earlier in a Kremlin vote that had caught him almost completely off guard. And now, with the help of his son Sergei, he was beginning to dictate his life into a portable tape recorder. The dacha was not a secret from anyone. KGB personnel watched the property. Listening devices had been placed inside the house, which is why the old man often preferred to work outside, on a bench in the garden or along the paths that ran down to the river. The recorder he carried in his jacket pocket was heavy enough that his wife Nina asked him why he needed to drag it around with him. He needed to drag it with him because the house was listening. His name was Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. He had led the Soviet Union for more than a decade. He had stood in Red Square at the May Day parade reviewing missiles. He had sat across a table from John Kennedy in Vienna. He had pounded on a desk at the United Nations. And now, on a bench in his garden, or out in the woods where the recorder could pick up his voice better than the bugs in his living room could, he was saying into the microphone the one thing about the Second World War that he had never been permitted to say when he had the authority to be heard. He was saying, among many other things, that Stalin had told him in private conversations over years of Kremlin dinners that the Soviet Union could not have won the war alone. That without American Lend Lease, without the trucks and the planes and the food and the gunpowder and the steel that the United States had sent across 3 oceans to keep the Red Army in the field, the war would have ended somewhere short of Berlin, possibly somewhere east of Moscow. Khrushchev chose his words carefully. He said that no one spoke about this officially. He said that Stalin, as far as he knew, had never left any written record of the opinion. But he said Stalin had expressed it to him several times, and he, Khrushchev, now wanted to set it down before he died. Within 3 years, the first of those tapes had been transcribed, translated, and printed in the West, in a series of books that would eventually sell by the hundreds of thousands of copies. The most candid passages about Stalin and Lend Lease would appear in a later volume, drawn from the same long flow of dictations, published after Glasnost had cracked open the Soviet archives. In the Soviet Union itself, every volume would be denounced as a forgery, banned from import, and kept from the reading public for the entire remaining life of the state. That is the compressed version of how one of the most important private admissions of the 20th century reached the outside world. An old, disgraced former dictator, dictating into a pocket recorder in a dacha garden, because no part of the system he had spent his life inside would allow him to say it in any other way. This video is about the gap between that private admission and the public story the Soviet Union told about the same war for nearly half a century. It is a gap measured in trucks, in aluminum ingots, in locomotives, in tons of canned meat, and in the careers of the men who knew the real figures and were never permitted to cite them. By the time we are done, I hope the meaning of one small number, 4%, will look very different from the way it was printed in Soviet textbooks from Stalin's last years to the day the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin. Before the aid, there was a war. Before the war, there was a law. On March 11 of 1941, Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the Lend Lease Act. Its formal title was An Act Further to Promote the Defense of the United States. Roosevelt had spent months pushing the bill through a Congress still tilted toward isolation. At the moment of the signing, the Soviet Union was not a candidate for American aid. It was something closer to a silent partner of the enemy. Moscow had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Berlin in August of 1939, invaded Poland from the east a few weeks later, attacked Finland that winter, annexed the Baltic states, and spent almost 2 years as a major supplier of oil, grain, and strategic metals to the German war machine. A young senator from Missouri named Harry Truman, the day after Germany attacked the Soviet Union, said in a remark carried by the New York Times that if the Germans were winning, the United States should help Russia, and if the Russians were winning, the United States should help Germany, and in that way let as many of them kill each other as possible. 4 years later, it would be Truman, now president, who would sign the order shutting Lend Lease down. In the summer of 1941, though, his line captured roughly the center of American opinion on the question of helping Stalin. The German invasion of the Soviet Union was launched on June 22 of 1941. Roughly 3.5 million Axis soldiers, German, Romanian, Finnish, Hungarian, Slovak, and Italian, crossed the Soviet frontier along a front that stretched for 2,000 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In the first 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht destroyed most of the pre-war Soviet air force on the ground, killed or captured more than 1 million Soviet soldiers, and drove armoured columns within striking distance of Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kiev. Most Western analysts, including the United States War Department, believed the Soviet Union would collapse before the first snow. Roosevelt did not believe it. In July, he sent his closest personal aide, Harry Hopkins, to Moscow to find out whether Stalin intended to keep fighting. Hopkins was a gaunt, chronically ill New Deal administrator with no diplomatic training. 2 years earlier, he had been diagnosed with stomach cancer and had had roughly 3/4 of his stomach removed in an extensive operation. What remained of his digestive system struggled to absorb protein and fat, and he was living with chronic malnutrition. He flew from Britain by Catalina flying boat to Archangel, then south to Moscow, and met Stalin on 2 consecutive evenings in the Kremlin on the 30th and 31st of July. He came home with a clear message. The Soviets would fight. They needed trucks, aluminum, high-octane fuel, machine tools, food. If Washington was willing to send them, Hopkins believed the Eastern Front would hold. Washington was willing. In late September, a mission led by Averell Harriman for the United States and Lord Beaverbrook for Britain arrived in Moscow and signed with Stalin what became known as the First Protocol, committing specific quantities of supplies by a fixed date. On November 6, in a speech marking the anniversary of the October Revolution, Stalin named Beaverbrook and Harriman in public and thanked them for what was coming. It was the only time during the entire war that he thanked the Allies by name in a speech broadcast to the Soviet population. From that acknowledgement forward, the official Soviet line on how much American aid actually mattered shrank and shrank until it collapsed into a single number: 4%. That number had an author. In the autumn of 1947, Nikolai Voznesensky, chairman of Gosplan and newly elevated to full membership of the Politburo, was finishing a short book on the wartime economy. He submitted the manuscript to Stalin for review before publication. Voznesensky had written, in 2 plain sentences, that Allied weapons, strategic materials, and food had contributed to the common victory. According to the memoir of his own nephew Lev, who inherited the family papers, Stalin read the 2 sentences, crossed them out in pencil, and wrote in the margin, in his own handwriting, a short Russian phrase that translates roughly as, "not that." The 2 sentences did not reappear. What did survive in Voznesensky's book, published in December of 1947 under the title The War Economy of the Soviet Union During the Patriotic War, was a single ratio. Allied industrial deliveries, Voznesensky wrote, amounted to only about 4% of Soviet industrial output during the war. Buried elsewhere in the same book was a more honest admission that imports of raw materials had risen 5-fold thanks to the Allies. That admission was lost in the shadow of the number Stalin had been willing to have in print. The 4% figure passed into the Soviet encyclopedia, into the school textbooks, into the anniversary speeches, into the films and the novels that would shape the Soviet understanding of the war for 2 full generations. There is a bitter coda to Voznesensky himself. On March 7 of 1949, he was removed from his posts on the Politburo and the Council of Ministers. On October 27 of that year, he was formally arrested as part of the purge that became known as the Leningrad Affair. On the last day of September, 1950, he was sentenced to death, and he was shot shortly after the verdict. His book survived him. He did not survive Stalin. The 4% figure did. Behind that number, however, sat a very different set of figures, and the men who had fought the actual war knew them. Between October of 1941 and September of 1945, the United States delivered to the Soviet Union something in the region of 375,000 trucks and about 51,000 jeeps. Across the same span of time, total Soviet production of motor vehicles of any kind came to fewer than 200,000. By the summer of 1944, when the Red Army launched Operation Bagration across Belarus in the largest Allied offensive of the Second World War, A third of its trucks were American. The 2.5-ton Studebaker US-6, built by the Studebaker Corporation of South Bend, Indiana, was so common in Soviet service that the name worked its way into the Russian language as a general word for a heavy army truck. Soldiers called it the Studa. When Soviet engineers looked for a chassis strong enough to carry the recoil of the famous Katyusha multiple rocket launcher, they mounted the launcher on the Studebaker, because the American frame could take the shock, and the equivalent Soviet frames could not. The aircraft arithmetic follows the same pattern. Allied Lend Lease delivered to the Soviet Air Force roughly 18,000 aircraft across the war, of which about 14,000 came from the United States, and the rest from Britain and Canada. Nearly 5,000 of the American aircraft were Bell P-39 Airacobras, a fighter the American Army Air Forces had judged mediocre for the European theater, and which turned out to be almost perfectly matched to the low-altitude, low-speed combat of the Eastern Front. The most celebrated Soviet pilot to fly the type was Alexander Pokryshkin, who ended the war with 59 individual victories, the second highest confirmed tally of any Allied fighter ace, behind only Ivan Kozadub of the Soviet Air Force. Pokryshkin defended the Airacobra throughout his career, and for much of that career he was flying an aircraft his own superiors wanted him to trade in for a domestic Soviet design. The rail numbers are more startling still. The Soviet locomotive industry built 446 engines during the entire war, and only 92 of them came out of the factories between 1942 and 1945. Lend-Lease supplied 1,911 steam locomotives, 66 diesel-electric locomotives, and more than 11,000 rail cars. Close to 93% of all Soviet wartime procurement of rail equipment came from Lend-Lease. Without those engines, the forward movement of troops and ammunition from the Urals to the German border could not have happened at the pace at which it actually did. The United States and the British Commonwealth together supplied about 55% of the aluminum the Soviet Union used during the war. Without aluminum, there is no aircraft production. They supplied more than 80% of the copper. Without copper, there are no radio sets, no shell casings, no field telephones. American Lend Lease shipped aviation fuel equal to about 57% of total Soviet production, with roughly 90% of the high-octane fuel coming from the United States. Most of the American fuel was blended with lower-grade Soviet fuel to lift it to the octane rating that Soviet fighters needed to stay with the Luftwaffe. More than half the explosives the Red Army fired came from American and British plants. Each one of these percentages was knowable inside the Soviet General Staff. Each one of them was known to Stalin, to Molotov, and to Mikoyan, the Politburo member responsible for foreign trade and for the distribution of Allied supplies. And each one of them was experienced, day after day, by the soldiers at the front, who saw what was stenciled in English on the hoods of their trucks and the crates of their shells. Food is the category of aid that is hardest for a modern audience to feel the weight of. The United States shipped to the Soviet Union, over the course of the war, something in the region of 4.5 million long tons of food, roughly a quarter of all American Lend-Lease tonnage. The manifests include canned meat, flour, sugar, butter, dried eggs, dried milk, and vegetable oil. A great deal of it went to the Red Army directly. In the first months of 1943, according to Soviet quartermaster records published decades later, American-produced food accounted for about 17% of the calories consumed by Red Army soldiers and about half the fats in their diet. The single item that became legendary was canned pork produced by the Hormel Foods Corporation of Austin, Minnesota, marketed under the brand name Spam. In a passage from the later volumes of his memoirs, Khrushchev wrote in a tone of dry amusement that without Spam the Soviet Union would not have been able to feed its army. Soviet soldiers tasted canned meat for the first time in their lives, from tins stamped with English labels. Children in the evacuation zones along the Volga tasted chocolate and powdered cocoa for the first time from American relief packages. The agricultural context behind the food shipments is almost never taught in Western classrooms. The German invasion overran, by the end of 1942, the single most productive farming zone of the Soviet Union. Ukraine and the Northern Caucasus, together, had supplied something on the order of 38% of Soviet pre-war grain, 60% of the sunflower oil, and a majority of the sugar and hogs. With those regions under German occupation, and with millions of peasants and farm horses now at the front, domestic food production inside the Soviet Union collapsed. What filled the gap between a starving army and a fed one was canned meat from Minnesota, flour from the American Midwest, and vegetable oil from plants in Chicago and Buffalo. The routes that carried this cargo into the Soviet Union were themselves a feat of wartime logistics that most Soviet citizens never heard described in any detail. There were three main corridors. The Arctic route ran from Scottish and Icelandic ports around the North Cape of Norway to Murmansk and Archangel. It was the shortest route, and also the most dangerous. German bombers based in occupied Norway and German submarines operating out of the fjords hunted these convoys through the continuous daylight of the Arctic summer and the continuous darkness of the Arctic winter. In July of 1942, convoy PQ-17 was ordered to scatter in the face of what the Royal Navy believed to be an imminent attack by the battleship Tirpitz. 24 of its 35 merchant ships were sunk by submarines and aircraft over the following days. Across the full span of the Arctic run, roughly 85 Allied merchant ships and 16 Royal Navy warships were lost, and about 3,000 Allied sailors died in water so cold that a man who went into it without a survival suit had about 3 minutes. The second route, the Persian Corridor, was longer but safer. Cargo ships sailed from the east coast of the United States around the Cape of Good Hope to the Persian Gulf. There the crates were unloaded at Khorramshahr, Bushehr, and Bandar Shapur, carried north by the Trans-Iranian Railway, and then driven by truck across the mountains to the Soviet border at Julfa. Britain and the Soviet Union had jointly invaded and occupied Iran in August of 1941 for exactly this purpose, to secure the route. In 1942, the United States Army took over operation of the southern half of the Iranian Railway and built assembly plants at Andimeshk and Khorramshahr, where American engineers and Iranian workers put together truck after truck from shipped-in components, drove them out to Soviet receiving points, and handed them over. At its peak in 1944, the Persian Gulf Command had about 30,000 American service members in Iran. Roughly 4.2 million long tons of American Lend Lease to the Soviet Union, about a quarter of the total, moved up through the Persian Corridor. The conditions these men worked in are worth describing, because they are almost entirely absent from American public memory. Summer temperatures along the Persian Gulf coast routinely topped 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The plants at Andimeshk were corrugated steel sheds on dust flats. Soldiers lost as much as 10 pounds a shift to heat exhaustion. Drinking water was rationed. The trucks, once assembled, had to be driven north through mountain passes that climbed to 7,000 feet and descended through switchbacks where a vehicle that lost its brakes had nowhere to go. American drivers and Iranian drivers alike died in these crashes. The Trans-Iranian Railway itself had been built only in the 1930s and was not engineered for the weight or the volume now running across it. American engineers, working alongside British and Polish crews, laid new sidings, bored new tunnels, and installed American locomotives with wheel gauges modified to fit Iranian track. The human pipeline that fed all of this was international in a way the Soviet version of the war never acknowledged. Polish refugees, evacuated from Soviet camps in 1942 under the Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement, worked as drivers and mechanics in the Iranian plants. African-American troops made up a significant share of the Persian Gulf Command's labor battalions, including railway operating battalions and port battalions at Khorramshahr. South African engineers ran several of the locomotive shops. The commander of the Persian Gulf Command from late 1942 was Major General Donald Connolly, who had been an Army Corps of Engineers officer before the war, and who ran the corridor as a construction problem first and a military problem second. The tonnage numbers climbed accordingly. In May of 1942, fewer than 30,000 tons of Lend-Lease moved through the corridor in the entire month. By July of 1944, the monthly figure had reached 282,000 tons. American engineering manpower, the same institutional talent that had built modern highways and dams at home, was now quietly running a supply corridor across a foreign country to feed a Soviet war effort in Ukraine. The third and busiest route was the one the Soviet public heard about least. Because the Soviet Union and Japan remained at peace until August of 1945, Japanese warships were required under the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact to allow Soviet-flagged merchant ships to pass through the North Pacific without interference. American cargo was loaded onto Soviet vessels in Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco, carried across the Pacific, and unloaded at Vladivostok and other Soviet Far Eastern ports for transfer onto the Trans-Siberian Railway. Close to half of the total American tonnage sent to the Soviet Union during the war took this route, which the Japanese Navy watched and did not touch. A separate operation, small in tonnage but large in its human interest, was the Alaska-Siberia Air Bridge, which the Americans called ALSIB. Aircraft built in American factories were flown by American civilian and military pilots to Great Falls, Montana, then north through Canadian fields at Edmonton and Whitehorse to Ladd Field at Fairbanks, Alaska. At Fairbanks, they were turned over to Soviet pilots, who flew them on across the Bering Strait to Nome, then deep into Siberia and finally on to the front. Almost 8,000 aircraft made the trip. At Ladd Field, before the Soviet pilots took off, they painted the red star of the Soviet Union over the white star of the United States Army Air Forces on the fuselage. A monument to the pilots of both nations stands today in Fairbanks, dedicated in 2006. In the official Soviet histories of the war that were printed during the Cold War, this route effectively did not exist. If your grandfather or great-uncle served with the American Merchant Marine on one of the Arctic convoys, or at the Persian Gulf Command in Iran, or at Ladd Field training Soviet pilots in how to start a P-39 in sub-zero weather, I would be honored to read his name in the comments. The men on those convoys and at those transfer points rarely make it into the big World War II films. Dropping a name here is the closest thing to a monument most of them will ever have. Which brings us back to the question the script keeps circling. If the scale of the aid was this large, and if it was known at the top of the Soviet state, why did Stalin erase Voznesensky's 2 honest sentences in the winter of 1947? Why did his successors keep the 4% figure in the textbooks long after Stalin himself had been denounced, long after the Soviet Union was a stable nuclear superpower, long after any propaganda need to deny American help had passed? The short answer is not personal pride, though Stalin had plenty of that. The short answer is ideology. The Soviet Union had been founded on a specific claim about how economies work. A socialist economy, organized by the state, owned by the workers, and walled off from the capitalist world market, was supposed to be not only morally but industrially superior to the capitalism that surrounded it. That claim was the public justification for everything that had happened inside the country in the 1930s. The forced collectivization of the peasantry, the 5-year plans, the show trials of engineers accused of sabotage, the terror against what Stalin's propagandists called bourgeois specialists. Every one of those enormous human costs was ultimately paid in the name of proving a Marxist proposition about industrial organization. To admit in print, in a Soviet book intended for Soviet readers, that the Soviet state had survived its greatest military test only because American factories had sent it trucks, aviation fuel, canned meat, and aluminum in quantities Soviet industry could not match, was to undercut the proposition at its foundation. The Soviet economy had needed to be rescued. The rescue had come from the country that Marxist theory said could not possibly organize production rationally. Stalin could not write, not that next to that admission because he was touchy. He wrote it because the admission would have cracked the intellectual floor of the state. That is also why his successors, who hated many things about him and dismantled many of the structures he had built, still could not pull the 4% figure out of the textbooks. To pull it out would have conceded a point about the Marxist economic model that went well past any one dead dictator's reputation. Khrushchev, the most candid of them about Stalin's crimes, delivered his secret speech in 1956 denouncing the cult of personality, released hundreds of thousands of political prisoners from the camps, and opened the Soviet press to a degree that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. But even he, while he was still in power, never stood up and said in public what he eventually said on that tape at the Dacha, that without American help the Soviet Union would have lost the war. He could only say it in retirement. He could only say it to a machine. The private record of what Soviet leaders actually believed about American help, as against what they were willing to say about it in public, has 3 main pieces. One of them belongs to Anastas Mikoyan. Mikoyan was an Armenian Bolshevik born in 1895 in a village in what is now northern Armenia. He joined the Bolshevik Party before the revolution, survived the Civil War, rose through the ranks of the People's Commissariat of Foreign Trade in the 1920s and 30s, and by the time of the Second World War was one of the handful of men in the Soviet leadership whom Stalin still trusted to run large operations without constant supervision. During the war, Mikoyan sat on the State Defense Committee, the small five-man body that ran the entire Soviet war effort, and he was specifically responsible for supply. Every ship that arrived at Murmansk, every truck assembled at Andimeshk, every bag of flour unloaded at Vladivostok, passed through a bureaucracy he oversaw. He served at the senior level of the Soviet government for more than 40 years, across 4 leaders from Lenin to Brezhnev. A Soviet joke captured the unusual achievement in a single line, from Ilyich to Ilyich without a heart attack or paralysis, Ilyich being the patronymic shared by Lenin and Brezhnev. Mikoyan died in his sleep in October of 1978, at 82, one of the very few members of Stalin's inner circle to die that way. In long recorded conversations with the historian Georgy Kumanyov during the 1970s, conversations that were only published after the Soviet collapse, Mikoyan put it in plain language. He said that in the autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union had effectively lost the industrial west of the country to the Germans. The great factories of Ukraine and the Donbass were in German hands, or were still on rail flat cars rolling east toward the Urals. The army was fighting on the reserves of a pre-war economy that was no longer functioning, and if Lend Lease had not come, if American weapons, American food, and American warm clothing had not reached the army when they did, he said, it is hard to say how things would have gone. The second piece of the private record belongs to Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was the most decorated Soviet commander of the war, the man who had organized the defense of Moscow in 1941, the counterattack at Stalingrad, the storming of Berlin in 1945, and the signing of the German surrender on the 8th of May. He was named Hero of the Soviet Union 4 times across his career and awarded the Order of Victory, the highest Soviet military decoration. And then, over the course of the next 12 years, his own government systematically pushed him out of public life. Stalin was the first to do it, in 1946, sidelining Zhukov to the obscurity of the Odessa military district because the Marshal of Victory was becoming a figure of rival popular stature. Khrushchev rehabilitated him briefly after Stalin's death, made him Minister of Defense, and then, in October of 1957, removed him again. The charge was Bonapartism. The practical reason was that Zhukov was too large a figure for Khrushchev to let remain at the center of the armed forces. For most of the next 15 years, Zhukov lived in a semi-official retirement, writing memoirs that Soviet censors repeatedly trimmed. The first edition of his memoirs, published in Moscow in 1969, ran to more than 700 pages but had been edited at the printing stage. Entire chapters on the opening catastrophes of 1941 had been cut. His candid assessments of Stalin, of the purges of the Red Army Command in the late 1930s, and of the scale of Allied aid, had been softened to fit the political requirements of the Brezhnev era. Zhukov was bitter about these edits. He complained about them privately. He had nowhere public to complain. In 1963, the writer Konstantin Simonov, a novelist and poet who had covered the war as a correspondent and who had known many of the senior commanders personally, spent several long sessions interviewing Zhukov in Zhukov's dacha outside Moscow. Simonov was one of the most respected literary figures of the Soviet establishment, a 6-time Stalin Prize winner, and someone Zhukov trusted to record what he actually thought. Zhukov believed the conversations were private. They were not. The KGB had placed microphones in the house, and transcripts of what Zhukov said at those sessions sat in a classified file for decades before excerpts began to appear in Russian publications in the late 1980s and 90s. In one of those passages, Zhukov told Simonov that people were now claiming that the Allies had not really helped the Soviet Union. It was not true, he said. The Americans had sent materiel without which the Red Army could not have formed its strategic reserves and could not have continued the war. He mentioned the vital role of American explosives and gunpowder. He talked about American steel, without which, he said, Soviet tank production could not have been organized at the scale it actually reached. and he noted with the irritation of an old soldier watching his memory edited in real time that some people were now saying the Soviet Union had had plenty of everything on its own. It was not the case. Zhukov died in June of 1974. By the time his unguarded words reached any general reader, he had been in his grave for well over a decade. His official memoirs, published in Moscow in 1969, had been edited to remove most of the substance of the same thoughts. A fuller edition, restoring many of the cuts, would finally appear in Russian after the fall of the Soviet Union. The third piece, and the most dramatic, belongs to Khrushchev himself. After his removal from power in October of 1964, Khrushchev found himself at Petrovo Dalneye with a driver, a doctor, a small pension, and a lot of time. He was 70 at the time of his fall, and he would reach 73 before the dictation project was fully underway. He was bored, humiliated, and furious. His son Sergei, a rocket engineer then in his early 30s, persuaded him to dictate his memoirs before they were lost. They found a portable tape recorder. They experimented. They worked out that the best reception was outdoors, away from the microphones in the dacha walls, and that the easiest concealment for the finished tapes was at the homes of trusted friends scattered around Moscow. By 1969, there were hundreds of hours of recording. Some of the material had been transcribed. The question was what to do with it. The KGB, under Yuri Andropov, was aware of the project in general terms, and there are indications in Taubman's biography and Sergei Khrushchev's own account that the eventual transfer of the material to the West took place with at least the knowledge, and possibly the tacit approval, of Andropov's service. The vehicle was a Soviet journalist named Victor Louis, a man with well-known KGB connections, who physically moved copies of the material out of the country. The material reached Gerald Schechter, Time magazine's Moscow bureau chief, who sent it on to a young Rhodes Scholar at Oxford named Strobe Talbott, the future Deputy Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, for translation. In December of 1970, Little Brown and Company of Boston published the first volume, titled Khrushchev Remembers. A second volume followed in 1974. A third, titled The Glasnost Tapes, appeared in 1990, and finally an unabridged 4-volume Russian edition came out in Moscow in the late 1990s. It was in that later material, drawn from the same long flow of dictations, that Khrushchev's most direct words about Stalin and Lend Lease finally appeared in print. In the Glasnost tapes, Khrushchev writes that he wants to give his candid opinion about what Stalin truly believed on the question of whether the Soviet Union could have survived the war without American aid. And he writes, in the form of a paraphrase of Stalin's own words to him over years of Kremlin conversations, that the answer was no. That one-on-one against Hitler's Germany, the Soviet Union would not have withstood the onslaught. That no one talked about this officially. That Stalin, so far as Khrushchev knew, had never left any written trace of the opinion. But that Stalin had said it to him more than once, in private, and that now, at last, Khrushchev was setting it down. Khrushchev did not live to see the later volumes. He died in September of 1971, 9 months after the first volume came out. He was buried in Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, under a monument by the sculptor Ernst Neizvestny that was half black, half white, for the two sides of the man, and, one can fairly say, for the two sides of the story he had finally told. Standing behind all three of these private admissions, earlier in time, is the one public admission Stalin himself ever made about the decisive scale of American aid. It was at the first of the 3 great wartime Allied summits, the Tehran Conference, held in the last week of November 1943. On the evening of the 30th of November, Winston Churchill's 69th birthday, the 3 heads of government gathered for a formal dinner at the British Embassy. Stalin rose to propose a toast. He did not toast Roosevelt personally or Churchill personally. He toasted American production. What was most important in this war, Stalin said through his interpreter, were machines. The United States, he said, was a country of machines. Without the machines received under Lend Lease, the Allies would have lost the war. The American delegation recorded the toast. Averell Harriman, newly arrived as American ambassador to Moscow, was sitting at the table. Charles Bolan, the American interpreter, wrote it down. In his 1975 memoir, Special Envoy to Churchill and Stalin, co-written with Elie Abel, Harriman would return to that moment again and again as the single clearest statement Stalin ever gave, in a setting where a written record would be kept of what he actually thought about the American contribution to the war. It was a stunning thing for Stalin to say in a room that included his two principal allies and their staffs. It was also the closest he ever came to saying it in a way that could later be quoted to the Soviet public. In the decades afterward, no Soviet newspaper reprinted the toast. No Soviet textbook quoted it. The Tehran minutes were published in the West by the State Department in the 1960s, and in the Soviet Union much later and in edited form. The public account of Soviet memory stayed stuck at 4%. What the men at the top actually believed, we can now reconstruct from Harriman's table notes, Mikoyan's Kumanyov interviews, Zhukov's bugged conversation with Simonov, and Khrushchev's walks in the garden at Petrovo Dalneye. Why did Stalin do it? Why did a man famous for his caution about written records let that particular sentence out in front of Harriman and Bolan at a British embassy dinner? The likeliest answer is that he was playing the longer game. At the end of 1943, the Red Army had won at Stalingrad, won at Kursk, and was pushing the Wehrmacht back across Ukraine. Stalin was about to ask Roosevelt and Churchill to fix the post-war map of Europe in a way favorable to him. A generous public acknowledgement of American production, in front of Roosevelt and with Harriman taking notes, was a small price to pay for goodwill across the table. He was not expecting Soviet historians to read it. He was expecting Roosevelt to remember it when the Polish border came up the next afternoon. The deeper structural reason he could not let the admission reach Soviet readers is the one already named. An admission that specific, repeated in Pravda and in the schoolbooks, would have cracked the ideological foundation of the state. A man can rebuild Stalingrad. It is much harder to rebuild a claim about the inherent superiority of the planned economy once you have conceded that the planned economy needed American trucks to stay on the road. The 4% figure, for what it is worth, was not a lie in the literal sense. The narrow ratio Voznesensky described, Allied industrial deliveries compared to Soviet industrial output across the whole war measured in rubles, is defensible if you measure it the way he did. What was dishonest was letting that single narrow ratio stand as a summary of the entire aid relationship, because the scale does not come across in the ratio. The 4% figure hides the fact that more than 90% of Soviet wartime rail equipment came from Lend Lease, that well over half the aluminum and the copper came from Lend Lease, that the fuel that lifted Soviet fighters into the air was blended from American stocks, that the trucks that made Bagration possible rolled out of South Bend and Detroit. A ratio is a useful thing if you want to obscure what matters. In a country where historians could go to prison for citing the wrong one, that utility was exactly the point. There is a quieter post-war story that says the same thing in a different register. When Lend Lease was terminated by President Truman in August of 1945, the United States opened negotiations with Moscow for a final settlement of the amounts that the Soviet Union was expected to pay for the civilian-type equipment, locomotives, ships, and factories that had been sent during the war and that could in principle still be used in peacetime. The total American valuation came to roughly $11 billion. Washington's opening position was modest, a token settlement in the low hundreds of millions. Moscow's counter was lower still. The talks dragged on through the late 1940s and into the 1950s with no agreement. The American negotiators kept detailed ledgers. The Soviet negotiators took the position that the scale of Soviet blood sacrifice against Hitler was itself the payment, and that American materiel, having been consumed in a war the United States had not yet entered, was a debt the United States owed history rather than a debt Moscow owed Washington. A final settlement was not reached until 1972 under the Nixon administration, at $722 million, repayable in installments stretching into the next century. The Soviet Union paid installments until it collapsed. The Russian Federation inherited the outstanding balance. Whatever else one believes about the balance of merit and sacrifice in that debate, the figures in the ledgers are the same figures the 4% line was built to hide. In time, and only in time, did the archives begin to open. Voznesensky's original manuscript, with Stalin's handwritten marginal note, survived in the party archive that is today called RGASPI. Harriman's Tehran papers are in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress. The minutes of the Tehran Conference have been in the State Department's Foreign Relations of the United States series since 1961. Khrushchev's tapes exist in the original Russian at Brown University's John Hay Library through the work of his son Sergei, who became an American academic in the 90s. Zhukov's candid words to Simonov began to surface in the Soviet press in the glasnost years. Mikoyan's Kumanyov interviews were published in full by a Russian academic press in 1999. The pattern in all four cases is the same. The admission could not be made in public while the system that made it dangerous was still running. The admission could be made to a microphone that someone else had hidden. It could be made to a loyal interviewer on the promise of posthumous publication. It could be made in a toast to foreigners in a foreign embassy, with the speaker trusting himself to keep it out of his own newspapers. It could be made by an old man walking in the woods with a German tape recorder in his coat because the alternative was taking it to the grave. What he said at Tehran, in the one moment he let a version of it into a written record, was that without American machines the Allies would have lost the war. What he meant, and what he could never say in Moscow, is that without American machines the Soviet Union would have lost it. His successors inside the Kremlin spent the next 40 years making sure no Soviet reader would ever come across that sentence in that form. They very nearly succeeded. What undid them, in the end, is that the admission had been made to too many different witnesses in too many different rooms, at least one of which, on the 30th of November 1943, had an American stenographer present. And two of the other witnesses, Zhukov and Khrushchev, had the unusual luck of speaking into microphones their own government had placed. The state could suppress what was in the newspapers. It had a harder time suppressing what was in its own files. If the quiet story of 4 witnesses and 1 sentence is the kind of history you want more of, tap the like button. It tells me to keep pulling at threads like this one. Subscribe if you want the next investigation. There are many more of these stories, in which the official version of a war and the private admission of the men who actually ran it sit on opposite sides of a wall, and the real history is the thing that was only ever said with the tape rolling.